Welcome to Module 3. This module is about your impact on the problems with out-of-school suspension that we've been discussing in the past two modules. In the first two modules, you learned about the risks and outcomes of out-of-school suspension, how exclusionary discipline is tied to racism and ableism, that out-of-school suspension contributes to negative outcomes in terms of academics, health, and justice system involvement, and how children who are involved in the child welfare system are also vulnerable to suspension and these negative outcomes. So in this module, we're going to talk about how you can apply all of that knowledge to your role as a child welfare professional. So what is your role in relation to the problems with out-of-school suspension? Some examples of how your role relates to out-of-school suspension includes if you work in a school or with children who are enrolled in schools that use exclusionary discipline, or if you work in the child welfare system or with children who are involved in the child welfare system, such as children who are in out-of-home care or whose families have been reported or investigated for maltreatment, or if you work with children who are involved in the juvenile justice system. You might be picking up on a theme. If you work with youth in pretty much any capacity, you have a role to play in helping with the problems of out-of-school suspension. So, what can you do? One important foundational step is considering how your own bias impacts your work. All of us internalize some kind of bias as we grow and develop. In the United States, white people in particular are taught racist ideas and attitudes in overt and covert ways, but systemic racism can also be internalized and replicated by people of color. So it is useful for all of us to examine these biases, so we can become aware of them and start to challenge them and unlearn them. One simple way to get started with this is to take a test at implicit.harvard.edu. They have a variety of tests that you can take to learn about your own biases in different areas. While it's only a start, this test can be the basis for asking questions and further discussion. Another important way to unlearn your own bias and grow your perspective, especially if you are a white child welfare professional, is to read the perspectives of scholars of color on relevant topics. In this case, two authors that we recommend are Subini Antianama, who has written several books on educational inequity as it affects children of color and children with disabilities, and Monique W. Morris, who has written about the school-prison nexus and school pushout, especially as it affects Black girls and girls of color in general. Growing beyond your own bias is important, but individual changes alone are not enough. The problems that contribute to disparities in discipline and child welfare are systemic. You can contribute to these systemic changes, and this section is designed to get you thinking about how. First, the groundwork for systemic change comes from understanding the needs and goals of community members who are most affected by these issues. Collaborate with people in your community who are working toward racial justice, Indigenous elders, and other leaders in the Indigenous communities around you. As your communication and partnership grows, you can be better informed about your role in taking actions on issues of racial justice and equity in schools and child welfare. You can start by evaluating organizations you work for or work with, whether these are schools, institutions within the child welfare system, or the juvenile justice system. What is the organization doing well in terms of promoting community, social inclusion, and supporting youth who might be at risk? What could be improved? For example, does the school you work with use exclusionary discipline? Or are there racial disparities in the child welfare institutions you work with? Think back on everything that you've learned in these modules and use that knowledge to inform your assessment. Where do you see the problems we have been discussing showing up in your own organizations or organizations that you work with? After you've identified some of the areas for improvement within your organization, the next step is to determine an achievable goal that you can work toward. These goals should be simple to explain, and you should be able to identify a time span in which they will be achieved. It's okay if this means starting small. The important thing is to start somewhere with a goal that will hopefully have a tangible impact, rather than setting unrealistic or vague goals that will never be achieved. Ideally, once your goal is accomplished, you will be able to build off of those results to set and achieve more ambitious goals. One of the most important aspects of organizing for systemic change within your workplace is to work together with your colleagues. These can be people who work at the same organization as you or whom you collaborate with at other related organizations. Find colleagues that share your concerns with inequities and disparities in school discipline and child welfare, or with the negative effects of exclusionary discipline. Discuss what you've learned or share these modules with them. Then you can start discussing how this all applies to your specific organization or organizations and talk about what your first goal should be. In addition, if applicable, you may want to gather some of your colleagues to discuss these issues with your supervisors, or you might want to add discussions on these topics in general, or your achievable goal in particular, to group meetings. So, we've discussed that in order to work towards solving the problems related to out of school suspension, it's important to become aware of and start unlearning your own bias, as well as working with your coworkers towards systemic changes within your workplace. Here are some questions for discussing or journaling for this module. As with the previous modules, you can pause between each question to write your answer or discuss with someone. These questions are particularly designed to help you think about how you can personally take action to make systemic changes related to out of school suspension. First, what are three things that your organization or in an organization you work with, like a school or your county's child protective services, are doing well to limit the negative effects of out of school suspension? That is to say, how does your organization promote or support social inclusion and community building, academic success, and support for children or students? What are three ways that your organization could improve to limit the negative effects of out of school suspension? And of these, which would be the easiest to act upon? What are three steps you and your colleagues can take to move toward a solution for the above mentioned issue? Thank you so much for participating in all three modules. We hope you have taken some information away that will be useful for you in your work, and hopefully you even have some plans for your next steps in confronting the problems with exclusionary discipline in schools and in the child welfare system.